Craig?
Yes, Prof. We've got 56 attendees so far. Maybe we can just give it another 1 or 2 minutes.
Okay.
Okay, it looks like we sort of fixed it about 56, so maybe we can get started if you're happy.
Good to go. Good morning, colleagues, panelists, members of the media. I'd like to welcome you to this, the first virtual media conference for the university, at which the University of the Witwatersrand will announce the first COVID-19 vaccine trial in Africa. My name is Zebulon Vilagazi, the Vice Principal and Deputy Vice Chancellor for Research and Postgraduate Affairs at the University of the Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, and your conference facilitator this morning. This is a story about a trial which I do believe does bring hope to all Africans and the world during this very challenging and difficult time. And most importantly, it's heartening to note that it's being led by world-class South African scientists working on this problem on the African continent in partnership with their peers across the world. In this case, it is the University of the Witwatersrand and Oxford University. My first job this morning is to introduce these leading scholars, and of course, we'll all have to ensure that you stick to our limited times. Our panelists are, I'll introduce them just now, Professor Johnny Mahlangu, Professor Shabir Madi, Professor Helen Rees, Professor Glenda Gray, Professor Jeffrey Mphahlele, and Dr. Sandile Buthelezi, who is the new Director General in the National Department of Health. Just a brief note about our housekeeping rules are that first, please mute your microphones now. Second, after the panelists have spoken, I will facilitate a Q&A session. Third, for now, please place any questions you might have in the Q&A panel on the screens, together with your name and the media house that you represent. Again, to the panelists, fourthly, please keep it short and simple owing to our limited time. For now, allow me to introduce Professor Johnny Mahlangu, the head of pathology, who is based in the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of the Witwatersrand and the chairperson of the South African Medical Research Council. Over to you, Professor Mahlangu.
Sorry, Prof. Vilakazi, I see he's just dropped off. He's probably going to join in now.
Okay, noted. You've had a technical jitter. Prof. Mahlangu will be joining us in a short while. I beg your indulgence. Apologies about that.
Stefan, I don't see Shabir either.
Craig, can you get both Professor Mahlangu and Madi on, please?
I'm actually on the call.
Okay.
Good.
Colleagues, would it be appropriate, owing to the limited amount of time whilst Professor Mahlangu is trying to connect, that we get Professor Madi to speak?
Yes, perhaps we can go with Professor Madi, and we'll give Professor Mahlangu a chance, an opportunity thereafter.
Okay, thank you. Okay, whilst we're waiting for Professor Mahlangu to rejoin, colleagues, apologies about that. Once again, is that I'll hand over to Professor Shabir Madi, who is the principal investigator of the study and director of the South African Medical Research Council's Vaccines and Infectious Disease Analytics Research Unit, VIDA, based at VETS, and is the Department of Science and Innovation, National Research Foundation, South African Chair in Vaccine Preventable Diseases. Over to you, Professor Madi.
So thank you, Prof. Lakazi, and good morning to everyone that's made the time to attend this morning's webinar. So what I'm going to do over the course of the next 15 to 20 minutes is really introduce you to, as Prof. Lakazi mentioned, the first COVID-19 vaccine study, which we are about to embark on in South Africa. So just by way of introduction, as Prof. Lakazi has mentioned, I got a research unit that's funded by the Medical Research Council in South Africa, as well as by the National Research Foundation. And by way of an introduction in terms of what we've been doing over the past 24 years, is that this research unit has really been at the forefront globally in terms of the clinical development of a number of life-saving vaccines, which are used in children especially. And in particular, vaccines, again, the leading causes of death from pneumonia and diarrheal disease. In addition to which, we've also been very much at the forefront in terms of vaccination of pregnant women, as an example for influenza. And most recently, looking at vaccinating pregnant women with the RSV vaccine, which is a leading cause of hospitalization in children under 1 year of age. Now, the reason why I mentioned this in the context of COVID-19 is that this is not the first time that South Africa will be embarking on what is really a first in any low middle income country on research which has got huge implications in informing policy, both nationally as well as globally. Because of the work that we've done over the past 24 years in terms of a number of these childhood life-saving vaccines, that has actually informed World Health Organization recommendations for the introduction of those vaccines into public immunization programs throughout the world, and especially focused in low middle income countries. As an example, the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine and rotavirus vaccine, which are now used in a majority of countries, each year saves roughly about 500,000 children from dying each year. In South Africa alone, it saves about 5,000 children dying since it was included into the immunization program. South Africa was one of the first countries in low middle income, of all low middle income countries, to actually introduce the vaccine into its public immunization program. And the main reason for that was because of our ability to provide the evidence from South Africa as to why it was necessary for these vaccines to be included urgently into our public immunization programs. So the clinical development of vaccines is something that is not foreign to us. It certainly is not foreign to my own research group. And there are a number of other institutions in the country that have been very much involved at a number of levels in terms of this clinical development of these life-saving vaccines. So obviously the reason that we gathered this morning is really to discuss the first COVID-19 vaccine clinical development that will be taking place on the African continent. And the question arises, if the question arises at all, is why do we actually need a COVID-19 vaccine? So what we've seen over the past few weeks is really sort of a downturn in terms of the outbreak of COVID-19 in high-income countries. In this particular example, I illustrate the experience from the United Kingdom and from Italy, where you see after a peak early around about the middle of April, there's been sort of a subsiding of this particular wave of the epidemic. In contrast, in South Africa, what we see is an escalation in terms of the number of cases. At a peak in the United Kingdom and in Italy, the average number of cases diagnosed each week was roughly about 35,000. And certainly in South Africa, in terms of the current trajectory, we're very much nearing that mark in terms of average number of cases diagnosed each week being close to 35,000. And that is despite there being limited, much less testing that's done in South Africa compared to many of the high-income countries. Now, does that on its own mean that the United Kingdom, Europe, United States, and other countries are out of the woods in terms of this particular problem of the COVID-19 pandemic? And the answer to that is we don't know. And the only thing that will allow them to sustain sort of what's occurring right now in terms of low number of cases is if they are able to effectively manage what we call the effective reproductive rate, which means that for every one person, that person should not, on average, infect another person. It should be less than one. The effective reproductive rate for this particular virus is at about 2.5, meaning that in a population that's completely susceptible, between 2 to 3 other people will be infected with every one case that's infected, and they will go on to continue infecting another 2 to 3 people. Now, the lockdown itself in many of these countries effectively was able to bring that effective reproductive rate to under 1. And if they are wanting to sustain this low level of number of cases, they would need to keep the effective reproductive rate less than 1. Is that something that's plausible? And the answer to that, we don't know. It really depends to what extent they're able to actually manage it. As we've been reading in the media, over the past few days, a number of countries, including in Italy, including in Spain, including in many of the states in the United States of America, including in South Korea, and including Beijing in China, have seen an upsurge in terms of the number of cases. And the reason for that upsurge is essentially is that with the lifting of a total lockdown, and where there's greater intermingling and non-adherence to these non-pharmaceutical interventions such as physical spacing and wearing of non-surgical face masks, we effectively can expect a rebound in terms of the number of cases because that effective reproductive rate is going to go above 1. And that is pretty much what also happened in South Africa. So on the left, what you basically see is that after that initial bump around about the middle of March, when we went into a lockdown, there was sort of some waning in terms of the number of cases. But during the level 5 lockdown itself, that effective reproductive rate in South Africa did not go under 1. So we had ongoing community transmission. And it comes as little surprise that with the non-adherence to these non-pharmaceutical interventions, we've got this rebound that is currently taking place in South Africa, more so in the Western Cape, but very soon we would be in a very similar sort of a setting in Gauteng and in many of the other provinces. So the magnitude of this rebound really depends on how effective we are with sustaining the non-pharmaceutical interventions. And obviously, being under level 5 lockdown is simply not an option for the next 2 to 3 years before a vaccine becomes available or until a vaccine becomes available. So in all likelihood, what we're going to experience in South Africa is similar to what is being experienced in many Northern Hemisphere countries, is that as soon as the lockdown is being lifted, we see an increase in terms of the effective reproductive rate, which lends itself to these subsequent waves. And we can expect subsequent waves of outbreaks of COVID-19, at least for the next 12 to 24 months, or unless a vaccine becomes available sooner. Now, in addition to that, our experience in terms of why we project there will be multiple waves, and although there's some reservations in making direct comparisons between the Spanish flu of 1918 and COVID-19, is that essentially even to the Spanish flu, there were at least 3 to 4 waves of the outbreak before it became sort of more of a seasonal virus where a large percentage of the population had already been infected, making that ability to transmit between people less efficient. And in fact, for the Spanish flu, the second wave was much more severe than the first wave. Part of the reason for that was because of the mutation of the virus, which fortunately doesn't seem to be the case with COVID-19. So what are we aiming to do? What we're really aiming to do is sort of take a lead on nature in terms of inducing immunity in a population in a much more controlled manner than would occur through natural infection, and at the same time trying to ensure that in a sense we do a better job than nature in terms of the type of immune responses that are actually elicited by exposure to what we call antigens of this particular virus. Now, what we do know about COVID-19, the SARS coronavirus 2, is that once a person is infected, a person does actually develop antibody responses, which are able to kill off the virus. It's got neutralizing activity. But that immune responses to the virus seems to be more robust in individuals with severe COVID-19 rather than asymptomatic individuals or mildly symptomatic individuals. And that has got implications because roughly about 95% of people that are infected with the virus are either mildly symptomatic or asymptomatic. So we're not too sure to what extent natural exposure would actually induce robust immune responses, which are actually sustained for a long period of time. In addition to which, what we also know, unfortunately, is that groups of individuals that are at greatest risk of developing severe disease, i.e. the elderly, actually have very poor immune responses to natural infection. So there are a number of unknowns in terms of natural exposure to the virus, which includes the duration of immunity following natural infection, the robustness of the memory immune responses, which are critical in terms of conferring immunity in the medium to long term, as well as to what extent this natural induced immunity will actually protect against subsequent infection, especially when the subsequent exposures takes place at a later stage in a person's life.
Colleagues, it seems we have a network issue here.
Zebulon, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Shabir. I can hear you.
Sorry about that.
We can hear you and we can see the slides.
Okay. So where are we in terms of COVID-19 vaccine development? Currently, there's more than 115 potential vaccines that are under development. Many of these vaccines currently are actually in a preclinical phase, which means that they haven't actually gone into human studies. Now, there are a number of technologies that are being used, which I'm not going to go into the detail on, including sort of traditional technologies where the actual virus itself is either weakened. As an example, measles vaccine is an example of a vaccine where the virus is weakened and is able to be used as a vaccine because it doesn't have potential to cause disease. Alternatively, that virus can be inactivated. As an example, the polio vaccine that's given as an injection is an example of an inactivated virus. In addition to that, the majority of the other vaccines that are used in immunization programs are what we call protein-based vaccines, where a certain component of the bacteria, of the pathogen is used. We understand that component to be important in terms of virulence of that particular organism, and that if you're able to raise antibodies to that particular sort of antigen, that antibody would protect one against developing disease when one is exposed to that particular pathogen. So those are the traditional approaches that have been used in terms of vaccine development. But more recently, and there are no vaccines that are currently licensed which have used this technology, are what we call viral vector vaccines, as well as nucleic acid platform technology in terms of development of vaccines. Now, these technologies have already been used in terms of therapeutics aimed at the treatment of cancer, as an example, or in terms of therapeutics trying to correct for congenital abnormalities. But these sort of technologies have not been previously used for development of a vaccine. And for COVID-19, it's really the first vaccine which is using these technologies that will go into licensure. So these technologies have been used previously in terms of experimental vaccines, but none of those have actually gone into licensure to be used in general for general use. Now, of these 115 vaccines, currently, there are 6 vaccines that are in human studies, of which the one is the one that we're going to be evaluating in South Africa. But also soberingly, is that of these 115 vaccines that are currently in development, we would be extremely successful if even 5 of these vaccines are actually eventually licensed. So with vaccine development, there's a huge attrition rate in terms of where people start off from and the number of vaccines that eventually go through the different hurdles, including showing safety, including showing efficacy, which is protection against disease, before they are actually licensed by regulatory authorities. And in the next 2 years, we would really be fortunate if we even had 2 of these 115 vaccines that are actually licensed for use throughout the world. So as a brief introduction to the study we are about to implement in South Africa, this particular vaccine was developed by the Jenner Institute at the University of Oxford. It is what is known as a non-replicating adenovirus vector COVID-19 vaccine. And the plan in South Africa is for this vaccine to be evaluated for safety and foremost safety, both in individuals with and without HIV. In addition to which, we're wanting to see how HIV-infected as well as uninfected individuals mount an immune response, and particularly in a group without HIV, how well the vaccine works in terms of protecting them against developing COVID-19 illness. The study itself is being sponsored by the University of Oxford, who will be collaborating with on the study, but the study is led by South Africans, with myself as being the national principal investigator. And the funding from the study is not coming from the United Kingdom, but rather it's being co-funded by the South African Medical Research Council and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The plan currently is to get the study started during the course of this week in 3 sites in Gauteng, with the possible expansion to 2 additional sites in the Western Cape over the course of the next 1 to 2 weeks. So what do we know about this vaccine and how much has been done in terms of evaluating whether it would work or not? There's been a number of studies that have been already completed in preclinical development, which basically looks at different animal models, including non-human primates, to show proof of principle in terms of the immunogenicity of the vaccine, as well as whether the vaccine actually protects against the challenge in non-human primates. And those data are now in the public domain. So that has been completed, and that allowed for the United Kingdom to start its phase 1 studies, which have also been completed, which basically tries to determine the best dosage that should be used in this sort of studies. Currently underway in the United Kingdom as well is an additional phase 2, phase 3 study, where we now really look to see whether the vaccine protects against disease in 10,000 individuals, of whom 7,000 have already been enrolled in the United Kingdom. And they anticipate that they will have completed enrollment of those 10,000 by the end of July. In the United Kingdom, a large percentage of those individuals that are now being enrolled are healthcare workers. So the studies that we are about to embark on in South Africa basically plans on enrolling 2,000 individuals in South Africa, and in a separate study in Brazil, which will also be initiated during the course of this week, they're planning on enrolling a further 5,000 individuals. These 3 studies are all different studies, and each of them are designed to be able to show whether the vaccine works in their own locality. In addition to which, there's another study that has been currently planned for the United States that will enroll up to 30,000 individuals in the United States. So before we were able to start the study, we obviously had to go through a number of approval processes, which included approval by the University of Witwatersrand's Ethics Committee, the South African Health and Pharmaceutical Products Authority, SAPRA, as well as the Ethics Committee at Oxford University. And last but not least, we needed to get approval from the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries for us to be able to import the product into South Africa. Now, what this vaccine is all about is that it takes a viral vector, which is known as adenovirus. Adenoviruses are viruses that are very, very common in humans. They usually cause a very mild illness. But the adenovirus that is being used in this particular vaccine, in fact, is not found in humans and doesn't usually cause infection in humans at all. But rather it comes from a different species, and that particular adenovirus has been genetically engineered to be such that it is unable to replicate. And I think that's important. This is a non-replicating adenovirus, which means that when given, when administered, it doesn't have the capacity to continue replicating as would occur with the virus that is alive. This particular non-replicating adenovirus has had the genetic sequencing, which codes for what is known as a spike protein, which is these proteins that are found on the surface of the coronavirus, which we believe to be important in terms of the virulence of the organism. That genetic material has been inserted in this adenovirus, allowing for the expression of those proteins on the surface of this particular vector. When that is injected into the individual, the immune system is such that it processes that and it allows for that spike proteins to be presented to the immune cells in the body, and that elicits an immune response. And the immune response that it elicits includes development of antibodies. Now, the circulation of those antibodies is what protects one from developing disease. So when one becomes exposed to the infection, that antibody will attach to the spike protein and prevent that virus from attaching to a human cell. And that is the entire philosophy behind vaccines. It's really to produce antibody largely, which allows that sort of interaction between the pathogen and the body tissue from being avoided. In addition to which, some of these vaccines also produce cells which are known as cytotoxic cells that are able to directly kill off the virus as it enters into the body. So what we're planning in South Africa are 3 different groups. We're starting off literally tomorrow starting off with group 1, which are people without HIV that will receive 2 doses of the vaccine that are spaced 4 weeks apart. And this is basically to do an intensive analysis in terms of the safety of the vaccine, as well as in terms of its immunogenicity. Over the course of the next week or so, we will then start with group 2, which is a larger group of 1,900 individuals. And this particular group, at this stage, we're planning on giving a single dose of vaccine, but depending on the data that comes from the Oxford study, where a 2-dose schedule is currently being evaluated, we might or might not decide to actually include a second dose of the vaccine. This particular group is probably the most important group because it gives us a greater window of insight in terms of the safety of the vaccine, as well as whether this vaccine actually protects against COVID-19. So in this particular group, we're evaluating for vaccine efficacy. Last but not least is after group 1 has been completed, we will then embark on a small study in people living with HIV, really to see how they actually respond to the vaccine given 2 doses spaced 1 month apart. All of these participants will be followed up for 12 months, including having calls every 2 weeks to assess for respiratory illness. And if they do have symptoms, they will be investigated for COVID-19. In addition to which, throughout the 12-month period, all of them will be evaluated for safety in terms of any sort of adverse events that might occur. And what allows us to be able to decide whether the adverse event is from the vaccine or not is what we call a placebo group. In this particular study, the placebo group, which means that you're giving an inert substance to that individual, serves as a control group, is going to be normal saline. And that allows us to understand whether the vaccine works, as well as whether there are any differences in terms of adverse events, which might be or might not be more prevalent in the group that actually received the vaccine. So the importance of having a placebo group is essential to best quantify both the safety of the vaccine as well as its efficacy. So who do we plan on enrolling? Essentially, we're looking at adults between 18 to 65 years of age that are willing, that provide informed consent and are able to show an understanding in terms of the study through an assessment before they actually get involved, before they actually enroll. They need to be able to comply with all study requirements. They need to test HIV negative for group 1 and group 2. And if they're females, they need to be on contraception. In terms of the exclusion criteria, we're basically excluding people that are pregnant or planning on becoming pregnant, that are lactating at this point in time, individuals with a history of chronic respiratory or cardiovascular disease, people that are very obese, as well as people that might have had a respiratory illness in the past month. Now, all of this is really geared towards, like I said, relatively healthy individuals up to 65 years of age. And there is a possibility that this vaccine will be less immunogenic and less efficacious in people older than the age of 65. But that itself is not a complete disaster, because one of the things that we're hoping to be able to achieve with vaccination is what we call herd immunity. Now, what herd immunity is all about is that when there's a certain threshold of individuals that are actually become immune to the virus, the ability of that virus to transmit in the population, including to transmit to people that are not vaccinated or people that would mount a poor immune response to the vaccine, is actually diminished. The effective reproductive rate is driven to under 1. So what we believe will happen is that even if this vaccine is not completely as immunogenic and as efficacious in the elderly, in people older than the age of 65, or others with other medical conditions, if we can get at least 60% of the population to develop immunity by vaccination, we will be able to actually reduce the risk even of those individuals that aren't actually able to mount an adequate response to the vaccine. So finally, in terms of timelines, we anticipate to be enrolling the first subject tomorrow. That will be done in Gauteng, and we wanting to enroll 2,000 subjects over a period of over a relatively short period of about 2 months, hoping to conclude by the middle of August. All of the subjects will subsequently be followed up for at least 12 months. And then in terms of when we'll know whether the vaccine works or not is dependent on how quickly we accrue individuals that unfortunately will have got infected with COVID-19. And as soon as we have 42 cases in the study, at that time point, we'll be able to analyze to see whether or not the vaccine provides at least 60% protection against COVID-19. Over and above that, importantly, is that this study is being monitored by an independent data and safety management committee, in addition to the oversight by the ethics committee as well as SAPRA. That safety and that data and safety management committee, monitoring committee, basically reviews the data from the United Kingdom, from Brazil, as well as the South African studies almost on a weekly basis. So unfortunately, until we have a vaccine that is available, all that we really have available to us right now to be able to reduce the rate of transmission of this virus are the non-pharmaceutical interventions. And we're really going to be compelled to adhere to these sort of measures for the foreseeable future, at least probably for the next 2 years, unless a vaccine becomes available for us to be able to mitigate the full potential impact of COVID-19 on South Africans. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'd like to hand you back to Prof. Vilakazi.
Thank you, Professor Mari. Now, I'll hand over to Professor Johnny Mahlangu, if he's able to join us, the head of the School of Pathology and chair of the Medical Research Council. Professor Mahlangu.
Prof. Vilakazi, Prof. Mahlangu is still struggling with his audio. I'm just busy trying to help him get it sorted out. So maybe we can just move on to the next speaker so long.
Okay, thank you. Thank you once again, Professor Mari, for that very exciting presentation, and we look forward to seeing how this process develops. And now, colleagues, I'll hand over to and call on the next speaker, Professor Rees, who is the chair of the Africa Regional Immunization Technical Advisory Group of the World Health Organization, chair of the Program and Policy Committee of the Vaccine Alliance, chair of South Africa Health Products Regulatory Authority, and executive director of the Vets Reproductive Health and HIV Institute. So over to you, Professor Rees.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. And thanks very much, Shabir, for that very comprehensive introduction. And this is actually a really exciting time. This will be the first COVID vaccine trial in the African region. So I got the privilege of working with Shabir on this study, and also working with him on ALIVE, which is one of VIT's flagship programs on vaccinology. So VITS really does have a major interest in vaccines and vaccine development. But I'm talking today more with a global health hat on, because I serve on a number of committees, as you just heard, that have global interests in developing and disseminating vaccines, particularly to the poorest countries of the world and including the African region. So I'm going to start by just giving you a little story. I chair a scientific advisory committee for a group called CEPI, which is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation. And in January of this year, we had an emergency meeting of that scientific advisory committee because of this unknown virus that had been identified in China. CEPI's role, CEPI was set up after the Ebola outbreaks in West Africa. It has a lot of global international funding, and its role is to develop vaccines against emerging pathogen threats. And it's invested in a number of neglected pathogens with the aim of getting effective vaccines. So in January, we had this emergency meeting to decide whether or not this unknown virus was such a threat that CEPI should invest global funds in developing vaccines. And I recall very clearly that one of the colleagues said, this could be pathogen X. Now, pathogen X is something that in global health terms we've talked about a lot. And this is the pathogen we've all feared for many years. We all thought it would be respiratory. that it had the potential to spread really rapidly around the world, and that it would cause high mortality. And in January of this year, we didn't know if that was the case. But indeed, COVID-19, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, has turned out to be that pathogen X. CEPI invested in 8 vaccines, including the Oxford vaccine that Shabir has just described. But since then, and I'm going to up Shabir's 115 vaccines in development, there are now 268 candidate vaccines in development, which is unprecedented worldwide in terms of vaccine development. So having talked about that, the dialogue around vaccines and vaccine development then changed and expanded. The early vaccines that were in development came from the Northern Hemisphere. They were developed in China, they were developed in the UK and the US, and from more developed economies who were able to change rapidly and look at their own technologies and move into vaccine development. The early trials were in the US and the UK and China. The concern that was then raised globally was that we cannot only have vaccine development in the Northern Hemisphere. We really need to have vaccines tried and tested throughout the world in all populations. And there are several reasons for that. One is that we want to know if vaccines are safe and effective in all populations. And to do that, we need to then have this global spread. The second is, and it's something we don't often think about, but it's really true for clinical trials and clinical trial participants, and those of us in research know this. If you talk to people participating in trials, they'll often say, the reason I want to do it is because I want to give back. I want to give something. Or I know somebody who had that disease and I want to protect. I don't want to see that happening again. There is a true sense of altruism from many people who participate in trials. And because this is a global pandemic, there needs to be that opportunity for many people around the world to be able to express that solidarity and that global altruism. So that's the second reason. But the third reason is that if we participate in trials, there is quite a strong moral obligation for us to be able to say, we've helped develop what we hope will be a successful vaccine. Therefore, we want to ensure that the people in the country where it was developed and the region in which it was developed have access to those vaccines. Unfortunately, what we're seeing at the moment is what we're calling vaccine nationalism, that in fact vaccine production is being ring-fenced for particular countries. And obviously the richer countries and the richer areas are trying to say, my country first and all my citizens first. So there's a very, very important global dialogue now going on about vaccine access, which says, actually, if we develop vaccines, these need to be available to all citizens of the world. There might and will have to be prioritization because the amount of vaccine available to begin with will be limited. And we might have to think about groups such as healthcare workers first. But what we are arguing is that it cannot be my country and my country only first. So what started off as a conversation about pathogen X has become a massive global discussion about access. And one of the last things I'll just mention in this regard is the impact of false news, of anti-vax movements, and of a very unfortunate incident that occurred a few months ago where 2 French doctors had a dialogue where they talked about vaccine trials in Africa, and it was interpreted as being a very oppressive and exploitative approach to participation in vaccine trials. And it has caused a lot of discussion and a lot of concern in the African region. But we have to counter that with the arguments that say, actually, we want to be in trials. We want to participate. We want to be part of this scientific endeavor. Minister Zweli Mkhize has been part, as you know, we're leading the African Union at the moment, has already entered into that dialogue on behalf of the African Union about access for the African region, and is totally supportive of South Africa's participation in trials. Thank you.
Thank you for Professor Rees, and also thank you for giving us the background into the story, and most importantly, for clarifying the issue that raised its ugly head a few months ago. Now, I'll hand over to Professor Gray, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the South African Medical Research Council and a research professor in the School of Clinical Medicine at the University of the Witwatersrand. Over to you, Prof. Gray.
Thank you. DG Sandile Buthelezi, Zeblon Vilakazi, Johnny Mashlangu, other colleagues, all protocol observed. It's wonderful to be here today to witness the first, the announcement of the first coronavirus vaccine to be studied in Africa, and indeed in South Africa. So the South African Medical Research Council is a major funder of this program. And for those of you who don't know, our mission is to fund and conduct research that changes the lives of South Africans. So you can see why this is a very important study for us. Before the epidemic started in South Africa, a group of scientists, together with members of the Department of Health and the Department of Science and Innovation, got together and developed a research strategy for South Africa to try and see how we could make local innovation to combat the COVID epidemic in South Africa. And we were able to mobilize resources and get funding from the Department of Science and Innovation and release other funding from the MRC to conduct to start to fund a whole lot of research in South Africa. And this research started off with surveillance, trying to understand how the epidemic was unfolding in South Africa. It also entailed investment in finding local solutions towards testing. We also are collaborating with other funders to fund clinical interventions and therapeutic interventions for COVID infection, as well as understanding the immunology of the COVID epidemic in South Africa. What's very important as well is the issue around prevention, and we became very interested in funding work on vaccine design and development. And we looked at both local vaccine design and development as well as collaborating with international groups. And so this is the reason why we have collaborated with the Gates Foundation to fund this very important research that looks at both HIV infected and uninfected people and tries to understand immunology and also answer the issues of preliminary efficacy. So this is very important. And this is one of 3 vaccine trials that will start this year. Very soon on that, we hope the AD26 J&J program will start, as well as an AD5 program that we're collaborating with people from Los Angeles. And so we are very proud and very excited to see this program work. And we look forward to seeing Shabir expand this to the rest of South Africa, and hopefully the results will be very encouraging. So it's very great to be here, and thank you very much for allowing us to participate.
Thank you, Professor Gray. And colleagues, just a reminder that a press pack was emailed to all of you a few moments ago. So, following Professor Madi's presentation. So now with Professor Johnny Mashlangu having joined us, I'd like to hand over to him, who is the chair of the South African Medical Research Council and the head of the School of Pathology at Wits University.
Sorry, Professor Vilakazi, he's still not able to talk to us. He's in the meeting, but his microphone doesn't want to work. So I think if we can just carry on, we're just trying to get him to be able to connect to us.
All right. So then that then I'll hand over. Thank you, Craig. I'll hand over to Professor Jeffrey Mphahlele, the Vice President of the South African Medical Research Council. Over to you, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Program Director, and good morning, DG, Dr. Sandile Buthelezi and colleagues. I think it's quite fitting that we need to congratulate Professor Shabir Madi for this groundbreaking and world-class research, because from the perspective of a Health Science Council, as the South African Medical Research Council, clinical research certainly offers great opportunity to improve and advance the quality of health. So a new pathogen like SARS-CoV-2 really requires rapid and responsive research with a view to optimizing development of new health solutions, as you have already heard. So the need for a vaccine obviously cannot be overemphasized, and only vaccines are the only proven public health biomedical interventions to control, eliminate, and also eradicate infectious diseases. We know that it is through the vaccines that we have been able to control dreadful and fatal infectious diseases like measles, whooping cough, and hepatitis B. And it's actually through vaccines that we have been able to eliminate other infectious diseases like tetanus. And also, just to add that it's through vaccination that we have been able to eliminate, rather eradicate smallpox. And the world now is at the cusp of eradicating another infectious disease, polio, which was crippling and a deadly infectious disease as well. So we really know the importance of vaccines, and you know, the R&D in vaccine development is necessary and is something that we need to support at this stage, because it's only through vaccination that we can contain this pandemic, which is due to COVID-19. So we are hopeful about this trial that is going to start tomorrow. And we think that should a vaccine be developed, the first thing is that we wish for is that the vaccine would be highly immunogenic in the majority of recipients. We know that this might be difficult in other age groups, like you heard from Professor Shabir Mahdi in the old age group. But we are hopeful that the vaccine will confer long-lasting or even lifetime immunity or protection in the majority of recipients in all age groups. Because if that is the case, then we know this COVID-19 vaccine will form the backbone of national immunization programs in many parts of the world. And we need that kind of a vaccine so that we can accelerate the control of COVID-19. But not only the vaccine that will become the backbone of public health vaccination programs, but the vaccine that will offer an excellent example in terms of a life course immunization from childhood to elderly, because we know that this COVID-19 is affecting all age groups, and a vaccine that is under development now is an excellent candidate for a life course immunization. So with these few words, we like to really congratulate and support Wits University for this endeavor, and we hope that a vaccine will be found. Thank you very much, Program Director.
Thank you, Professor Mphahlele, for those kind and encouraging words.